Welcome to another video. Tonight we have 13 stories, starting with a tale of a mortician and shifting into stories involving the woods, monsters, and much more. A huge thank you to all of tonight's authors. If you have a story of your own, it can be sent to reddit.com/r/slumberreads. As always, if at any point you feel that the video deserves a like, please be sure to drop one. It would mean a lot. Subscribing if you're new is also greatly appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. Burned. Severe burns. 4th degree, we assume. The voice over the radio muttered. The truck engine rumbled, and gray plumes of smoke emerged from inside of the exhaust pipe. I put my keys in my cup holder and grabbed my radio. The truck door opened with a deep click, and I slowly got out, slamming the door on my way out. Rain dribbled onto the front of the white truck, erupting in small bursts that left little drops on my face. The concrete was wet, creating a glossy and frothy effect along the road. A brick corridor separated me and the gloomy morgue I'd worked at for years on end. I walked to the back of the truck and fidgeted with the lock. "How was the burn caused?" I asked the man. "Faulty equipment inside the ship. At least we assume. We haven't had any confirmation, but from what we assume, it had to have been a mechanical mishap. We couldn't find or recover any other bodies. They must have been pulled out to space when the interior was punctured." "Is the information about the accident classified?" I questioned him once again. "As for now, yes. Government officials will notify us when necessary." The metal doors swung open, and a terrible smell corrupted the fresh, misty air. It had the stench of rotten roadkill, searing in the sun. I cringed in horror. Yet I'd smelled the same thing a million times, and somehow I hadn't gotten used to it. I grabbed a cold metal stretcher and pulled it out of the truck. The tarp over the body fluttered in the wind, and it was as if the corpse was alive, grasping for another chance. I faced forward, right in front of the gray, concrete ramp. I pushed the glass doors away from me and rolled the stretcher inside. The morgue was barren as usual. The metal doors of the body refrigeration compartments opaquely reflected my workspace. I placed the charred body onto the silver autopsy table in front of me. I began to undo the tarp on the carcass. I reached into a small cardboard box beside the table and pulled out a latex glove and snapped it snug onto my hand. To begin the autopsy, I carefully chose a small surgical knife and began a small incision on his upper abdomen, where the burns and blisters were located. The epidermis was black and flaky, like a burned steak, left on the grill for hours on end. As I began cutting, the skin seemed to sizzle and smoke the deeper I got into the corpse. My grip on the knife weakened. A burning sensation shot up the scalpel and onto my hand, nearly fusing the rubbery glove to my fingers. The blade flew out of my hands and I stumbled back, bumping into a small metal table and dropping my clean, pewter-like tools. "Help!" I screamed in agony, writhing around, trying to take in the pain. "God damn it, somebody please!" I cried once more. I looked for my phone, looking around desperately, but I realized I had left it in the truck. No one came to help. It's ironic. There were dozens of people around me, and they were dead. It was almost as if they were mocking me. Newly formed blisters appeared on my fingers, and they started to move around and bubble. I ran frantically to the sink, grasping my wrist. My hand, searing, managed to turn the faucet on, and a cold stream of water blanketed around my blistered appendage. My fingers flaked up like the body I was operating. I turned the water off after about a minute to examine my hand, and it seemed like it was slowly spreading. As it spread up my hand, it started to burn my flesh, like reaching into an open flame. I grabbed a paper towel off of the roller and tore it. I rinsed the towel in water, squeezed it out, and wiped my hand off, trying to remove it. My hand was just a bloody, irritated stump. My fingers were unrecognizable, as a thick coat of bullous covered them. They filled with a white-green pus, expanding and popping. I didn't know what to do next. I was trying to understand what was happening to my arm. Bloody paper towels littered the floor from the wound, and I scrambled to my feet, running to the glass doors. I pushed the doors, tripping down the stairs, each step sending a sharp pain in my side. I cried out, holding my wound as the rain pelted my horrific stump. The water was like molten lava to me. Each droplet burned into my arm, making the blood spurt onto the rough, most concrete and rhythmical fashion, spewing white pus all over. After minutes of little drops of rain falling on my body, my nerves were so damaged I couldn't feel a thing. The bubbled blisters were dull, and the blood and pus made my head light. I thought about what to do next. If I could just get my phone out of my truck. I got up, determined to call 911 and get help. Adrenaline fled through my veins, and I managed to get up onto my feet and dart out of the front glass doors. I busted out, lost my footing, and tripped down the stairs, colliding with cold, solid concrete, busting my chin on the wet concrete. Rain pelted on my sizzling wounds as I tried to regain my breath. My legs were weak and bruised. When my bloody stump of a hand bashed with the gray cement, it split into 3 terrible segments of long, crimson skin. I expected to pass out from the pain, but my nerves were completely gone from that limb. When I managed to tolerate all of this pain, I tried to get back on my feet, but I sensed something squirming in my arm. The terrible mess of a hand squelched and twisted. The 3 long skin chunks that remained on my left arm fused together and writhed. I felt it. I knew that something was inside of me, a living, moving, breathing thing. At this point, I gave up. Life just wasn't worth living. I knew screaming would do no good. I was excluded from most of society, and the fact that the area was gated didn't make it any better. As I accepted my hellish fate, I took one look inside of the morgue. I saw something shiny glimmering in the fluorescent light, reflecting brightly into my eyes. It was my only choice. The scalpel, I thought to myself. It was the only way. I stumbled to my feet and crawled to the 4 brick steps that led to the comforting light of my workspace. I had assurance and confidence that I would survive. I fumbled up the steps. My vision was blurry, and I pushed forward on the black iron bars in front of the glossy doors. As soon as I entered, I fell to my knees, wiping the blood from both of my forearms on my shirt. I inched forward, crawling on my aching knees and elbows. I reached for the knife and grabbed it as tightly as I could. The metal was ice cold, but my body was stiff and hot. I felt like hundreds of pins pushed into me all at once. Anxiety swept over me. The pain was surprisingly timid, and I just kept scraping and scraping. Chunks of blood and flesh fell onto the tile floor. I carved deeper and deeper. My nerves were completely sizzled, making me unable to feel anything from the elbow down. As I was shredding my hand, I saw something moving away from my elbow to my neck. I smirked as I moved the scalpel upward and stabbed it into my shoulder where the moving bulge was. My nerves were still working there, and it sent a stinging sensation along my neck. Trickles of blood were sliding down my forearm, and I reached in to grab the creature inside of me. I pulled it out with a terrible spurt of blood flowing. It was a nasty little fella. Its skin was brownish red. It had human-like bulging eyes. The limbs on the abomination were twisted, and it struggled to escape my grasp. My head felt light, and I struggled to breathe. The puddled blood on the tile floor had been growing by the second. I closed my eyes, and everything went dark. I woke up in a pool of my own blood. My clothes were crusted brown from my wounds, and my mouth had a disgusting metallic taste. I spat on the floor and looked around. The corpse that was previously on the table had vanished, and the disgusting little cretin from earlier had disappeared as well. The fluorescent lights flickered, and I took off my jacket to cover my wounds. I tied it around my neck to cover the massive gash over my shoulder. The only sounds were the buzzing from the flickering bulbs and something that sounded like tapping on the floor. After all that happened, I'd need something to defend myself with. I scanned the floor and saw the scarlet-soaked scalpel on the ground. I slowly leaned down and grabbed it. Blood touched the tips of my fingers as I fished the knife out of the red, vicious liquid. I wiped the scalpel on my dirty, gore-covered shirt and paced around the morgue very carefully. Every time the lights flickered, I felt as if something was near me, walking around the small corridors. Maybe it was messing with me. Maybe it was closer than I thought. I stumbled into a corner, where I stayed for what seemed like an eternity. I held the knife up, shaking and trembling. If I had lost any more blood, I'd say I'd probably be dead right now. The adrenaline rushed through my body, and I was ready to attack at any second. I thought something would jump at me, or pounce from the ceiling. But those expectations changed when I saw a slight silhouette in the dark hallway parallel from me. I blinked and tried to make out what it was. It looked bulky. It slowly shifted around, and every once in a while, it had let out a quiet, wet snarl. I held my breath and tried not to draw any sudden attention to me. The thing made its way towards me. Each step let out a terrible, wet, sludgy echo that resonated in the morgue. Dread filled every inch of my body, and terror fled through my veins. As I focused on the thing, I noticed something. It had an ashy, burnt upper body with a crippled torso and mutilated face. Its lower body was twisted and wet. What is this thing? What is it? It was the corpse. I was getting killed here. Ironic, huh? Dying in a morgue. I bet my friends would have a good laugh about that. I didn't think twice about fighting. At this point, the creature was at reaching distance. After all this fighting, I just wanted to close my eyes and sleep. I woke up with a terrible headache. Sirens pierced my ears and blue and red lights flashed like thunder. I was in an ambulance. I could feel the rubble below me crunch beneath the speeding wheels. I was so tired. My memory was fuzzy at the time. I don't know what was happening. The air mask surrounding my mouth filled my lungs with a slightly sweet-tasting gas. My limbs were numb and I couldn't move. Bandages were wrapped around nearly all of my appendages. The ride was kind of soothing, and when I arrived at the hospital, I felt a huge relief of hope. A sort of safe space between me and that disgusting beast. I zoned out for a bit, but I could feel fresh sheets and blankets surrounding me, like a warm hug. Dozens of pill bottles littered my nightstand, and I was forced to chug this despicable medicine every day. IVs were littered around my body in various places, and I was tucked into paper-like blankets. In some way, I felt dead. Like I was supposed to die. I should have died. Why am I still here? I have no purpose anymore. I wanted to get out of there and end everything already. As the days went on, I could notice my skin getting noticeably more dark and irritated. Dark veins shot through my body, and doctors came into my room regularly to check in on me. Every time they come in, they seem even more terrified than last time. I want to know what's going on, but every time I ask a doctor, they don't answer. All they do is stare hopelessly into my eyes and apologize to me. Why are they apologizing? I want to know what's going on. I don't have any answers. The only reason I released this story to the public is because I don't think I have a lot of time left. There's something squirming in my left arm, like some sort of electricity. This happened to me a few years back when I used to be big into caping and whatnot, but ever since this experience I've completely ditched the whole idea. It was around summertime and I had gotten around a 1-week break from work, so I decided to go for a tab ride and camp through the Arizona desert for 3 days. My then favorite hobby. I packed up my tent, ham radio, and everything else you could imagine a overly prepared camper would need and set out for 3 days by myself. The first 2 nights and days went by fine, but the third truly scared me out of the entire idea. I was taking my ATV up to one of the more rocky areas for some bumpy speed demon fun when a large chasm began to block the way. Directly next to it, a small blue cap, around the size of a child's. That's when I heard it. "Please, you have to help me." The voice of a child's, maybe the kind that wears small blue caps. Without hesitation, I began to harness myself into the role I brought along, find a sturdy rock, and begin my descent. That's what made me rethink my decision. "Please, you have to help me." The exact same pitch, tone, and volume. And I mean exact. Then the smell of 3-year-old garbage hit me. It smelled like something had been dead down there, and for long. The reek of rotten meat and the way the young boy called me had me out of there. The entire experience, looking back on it, looked and felt like a trap. When I had gotten to the top, I promptly hopped on my ATV to get the hell out of there. I made a mistake. Whatever was down there was mad, and it didn't want to sit there and cry about it. Screams, rubble falling, climbing. The ATV could barely start with how hard I was trying, but I still think I handled it the best I could. By the time I got out, the thing down there had climbed out and was chasing me down. I had been rock climbing in Vermont once. No harness. Life in the hands on Isaac Newton. This was scarier. As much as I didn't want to, I turned back to see the stuff of my reoccurring nightmares. There's no way something like that could run that fast. It was like its entire body was stuffed with gelatin and its organs were attempting to get out of its pale white skin and blood-soaked teeth. It was galloping with at least twice the speed of a horse. As I was speeding through the sandy terrain, I looked back yet again to see its eyes turn black and say, "Please, you have to help me." Same as before. Fuck no. I ran the machine with all its might. I nearly flipped over with all the speed in the back. Gas efficiency was out the door. I managed to lose it as I saw its, what I presume, captors trying to claw out of its most likely blood-drenched stomach. I spoke to some of the county officials, but they shrugged me off. I still have nightmares about it, and eventually threw out the ATV because I found blood on the wheels after the encounter despite it never coming that close to me, and it having a serious inspection afterwards. On some days the flashbacks get worse. I imagine how close I was to going down that chasm. If the ATV ran out of fuel, or if the little boy's voice would have made me persevere down through the stench. Some days, though, I smell horrible things coming from my empty trash can, still being empty when I check in an hour, and small cracks opening up in my driveway and closing tomorrow, or, if I have an especially bad day, a chance of a hat in the road a few meters down. On those days, I truly wonder if that thing actually gave me up as its prey that easily. This incident was the most terrifying experience of my life. This happened in the fall of 1982 in Baxter State Park, Maine. I lived in Manchester, New Hampshire at the time, and desperately wanted to get one last camping trip in before the weather changed and the region would become buried in snow and tourists from out of state for the skiing season. It was early November, and it was still warm during the day and nice and chilly at night, perfect for sitting around the fire and relaxing. I loved the outdoors. I still do. But the events of that night in Maine would leave a mark on me for the rest of my life. My wife worked all weekend at the hospital downtown, and both kids were at Grandma and Grandpa's for the weekend. I called in sick to work, loaded up my Bronco, strapped the canoe on the roof, and hit the interstate. I was on the water late in the afternoon. I loved this area because of how remote it was. I was a few miles from my launch site, where the truck was parked, when I spotted a perfect place to camp. I paddled toward the shore. This is a great spot, thought to myself. I set up my little tent, built a fire, and unfolded my pack chair to relax. The day turned into night, and I crashed out in the tent. The following day I woke to the sounds of birds chirping. It was a little cooler, but still great weather. I took my camera out into the forest to take some pictures. I did some fishing and just enjoyed the peaceful stillness of this remote wilderness. The day was uneventful, and soon after dinner, I lay in my tent with my flashlight reading. I must have dozed off because I awoke startled by something moving outside my tent. I lay still, but instinct told me there was something outside. I could hear the carefully placed steps of something. There are moose and black bear up here. Moose can be very dangerous if you walk upon them by surprise. The bears generally smell you before you see them and keep away. I lay still and listened. Whatever it was had stopped at the entrance flap of the tent. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out a faint, shadowy shape. I was wide awake now and on full alert. Whatever it was, I could hear it sniffing around and the panting of breath. I slowly began to unzip the tent when it ran off. I unzipped the flap of my tent and looked out just in time to see the branches swaying and hear the sound of something moving through the brush and into the deep woods. The sound of its footfalls told me one important thing. It was on two legs. That couldn't be right. I hadn't seen any other people since entering the park and leaving my truck at the trailhead. The tourist season for leaf peepers had passed, and even so, someone could only reach this location by the waterway. I suppose someone could be out here. Someone I hadn't seen or heard until they came sniffing and snorting around my campsite in the middle of the night. I guess it was possible. As the sun rose, I ate my breakfast but remained on guard. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt a presence in the forest. Someone or something just out of sight. I kept a .45 revolver when I camped out here in the North Woods. I wasn't concerned about the wildlife so much as the weirdos you might run across, the meth heads, the backcountry types. In my experience, the scariest thing you can come across when you're alone in the deep woods is another human. I couldn't be sure if someone were out here, but the paranoia had begun to take hold. It was dark now and I was inside my tent. I kept the revolver close and my boots on. I was done playing games. I sure didn't plan on shooting anyone, but I was damn sure to show them I was no easy target. I sat up quickly. I must have fallen asleep again because I was startled awake by movement all around the tent. The shadows everywhere, on all sides, in all directions. I could hear sniffing and snorting, low grunting, and raspy breathing. What the hell is happening? I thought in a panic. It didn't sound like people, but the height of the shadows cast against the flaps of the tent in the moonlight revealed prominent, upright figures. There must have been 5 or maybe 6 on all sides. Fear gripped me as the realization came over me. I was surrounded. The low growling started. It was unanswered back on the other side and all around me. Low, deliberate growling. Were these coyotes? Were the massive shadows just the light playing tricks on me? The growling increased in pitch and intensified, and I knew an attack was imminent. I pulled my revolver and fired straight up in the air. The next moments were a complete blur. I charged through the tent with just the clothes on my back, my .45 and the truck keys in my pocket. I bolted straight for the canoe and muscled it into the water. I jumped in and began paddling. I never looked back until I got far enough from the shore. I should have never looked back. They were standing completely still on the riverbank, their bodies crouched down with heads low, eyes reflecting in the moonlight. They looked like giant coyotes or maybe even wolves. 6 in total. I was transfixed by what I was seeing. I had never seen a coyote this large, this massive. As I sat in the safety of my little canoe studying these creatures, they did something I will never forget. They began to stand up on their hind legs. Each one would slowly raise to 2 legs. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. They all stood like men. These things. These creatures that had almost ambushed me as their prey. I turned and furiously paddled as the howling rang out behind me. When I was a child, me and my brother Jason would stay at my grandparents' house out in the country. It was a 1-story farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hundreds of acres of farmland, in every direction, as well as a big yard for us to play in. In front of the yard was the only stretch of road around for miles. The house became like a second home to us, with us even having our own room with a GameCube in it. We were our grandparents' only grandchildren, and because of that, they most definitely spoiled us. That old farmhouse became a sanctuary to me during elementary school, and even through middle school. It was a retreat away from all the stresses in the world, and we would just run around and play. As we got older, we went less and less. The drive got to be a bit much on my parents, and life seemingly had other plans. College came swiftly, and within the first year, me and my friend Tyler decided to get our own place together in an old shitty apartment building right off the campus of our university. It was without question a shithole, but for the price, we didn't mind. One night, I picked up my friend Josh and brought him over to work on assignments and watch old shitty movies. After checking the time and seeing it was around 2:30 a.m., we decided that it would be best if he just stayed at my place for the night. Besides, we had been drinking anyway, and didn't want him walking home even if only a little intoxicated. My roommate was out of town and he could sleep on the couch in the front room where he had been watching movies. I grabbed him some pillows and blankets and tossed them to him, and I sat in the recliner next to him. We began talking about horror movies, and that led us to telling the other about scary experiences we had throughout our lifetimes. While talking of things that go bump in the night, I had a memory surface that I had not remembered until just then. Did I ever take you to my grandparents' farmhouse for any reason? No, Josh said. I only ever met your grandparents at your graduation party. Well, when I was young, me and my brother stayed with my grandparents often, thanks to our parents' work schedule. When we were toddlers, we had our crib set up in the dining room, and they faced the door to the patio in front of the house. In front of the patio was the yard, and then the road the house sat on. I remember one night I saw a shadow on the other side of the door's window. Cars driving by would illuminate it, and it was an old, raggedy woman in what I guess was a nightgown just staring at us. After telling him this, he said that it was creepy, and was probably just a bad dream. We moved on without a second thought and talked for a while longer before calling it a night. The following day, I went home to have dinner with my family. When I got there, only my mom was home as Dad was at work and Jason simply hadn't arrived yet. "What have you been up to?" she asked. "Work and school is pretty much it. Josh stayed over last night, and we talked about horror stories for a while." "Oh, what kind of stories?" I told her about the story with the woman and how it was just a bad dream. While I was telling her this, her expression went from pleasant to serious. Once I finished, she asked what the woman looked like. The closest I can describe her is the person on the cover of the first Iron Maiden album. However, more feminine and not decaying. I told her I had a picture I can show her, and she got up to meet me halfway across the living room. I pulled up the album picture and showed her, and she sat back down solemnly. "Mom, are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost," I said, half joking. "I might have," she replied with an anxious laugh. So when I grew up there, the dining room was my old room, and it had a red see-through chandelier light that hung down. One night when I was probably 3 or 4, I woke up to use the bathroom, and I remember feeling scared. I looked up at the light for some reason and I saw that face looking at me. She was wearing pilgrim clothes or something. I ducked my head under the covers and must have fallen asleep at some point. I always thought it was a dream, but now, I don't know, she said with a laugh. Jesus, I said. That's weird. Was there some ancient burial ground the house was built on or something? I said jokingly. No, but the whole town was rumored to have demon worshippers in the 80s. Mom would never let me out after dark. I remember being upset as a teenager, but people ended up getting hurt from it, I guess. I was just a defiant kid. After that, we left it at that for the rest of the night. Dad and Jason came home, and we enjoyed dinner together. While everyone sat at the table picking away at the feast my mother had made and talking about everything new in life that had happened in the last few weeks, I found myself somewhere else. The town my mother had grown up in was only a 45-minute drive. How had I never heard of cults in the area? How had she seen something so similar to what I had? When I returned home that night to the dank apartment me and Tyler, my roommate, had called home for the last couple years, my mind was still fixated on a patio door miles away from me. Nothing was making sense to me. I should say, here and now. I don't believe in ghosts. I'm a fairly rational person, but my mind was wondering. The cults my mom had mentioned were around in the 1980s. However, the woman we had both supposedly seen was wearing old-timey clothes. For me, it was some form of nightgown, and for my mom, it was some kind of pilgrim's clothing. I should have asked her more. I sat down at the computer and searched the town she had grew up in, and cults related to it. I found very old articles until I found something interesting. My university had detailed documents on first-hand accounts over the cults. Thankfully, since I'm a student there, I was able to open them. For hours I read accounts of cattle acting weird, or doors opening, or people being stalked by creepy groups of people, and even a spot where the group supposedly sacrificed people. However, there was no proof of this. One document, though, stood out above all the others. Well written in the mid-90s, March 18th, 1996 to be exact. It didn't deal with the cult in the area. A girl named Susie wrote in a brief sentence, I remember when I was young, no older than 5, waking up to a silhouette standing with stringy, messy hair. It was so dark I couldn't see its face. I was petrified. I really don't know what to think of all this. I think I'm a fairly rational person, and I understand that more than likely it's just a coincidence. But 3 people having the same occurrence in the same town is oddly terrifying. Whether it was just nightmares or not, it seems to have terrified a few of us to remember it in great detail years later. It's because of that why I'm posting it on here. I'm really not sure where else on the internet it could go, but I knew it was interesting enough to at least intrigue a few other people. I figured that this page would be better than anywhere else and that you all can make your assumptions. Jenny Hanovers. That's what they were called. These stingrays that had been carved and dried looked so much more gruesome than I would have expected. They were being made for centuries, but I had never really heard of them. Apparently they were used in the 16th century to trick people into believing that demons exist, and very effectively, may I add. When I found out about them, I immediately thought that I could use one to finally beat my tick of a neighbor in the Halloween decoration competition. Year after year, I would scour the web and buy the most disturbing, fucked up things that I could find in order to give me an edge. But he had money backing him. Because of that, I would consistently get second place. This time, I thought, this time Jared will pay. A sick grin grew on my face as I dropped a couple $100 on it without hesitation. Despite the price, I had a feeling this would finally bring the results I was looking for. I fully admit that this behavior was a little bit obsessive for what would ordinarily be such a trivial matter, and looking back, we could have saved ourselves a lot of grief by just shutting up and living with it. However, over the course of several years, my rivalry with him grew into a hatred of his lavish lifestyle. My family and I had been living across the street from this buffoon for years. We had worked our asses off to live as comfortably as we did, and to watch some trust fund baby play loud music, constantly brag about his cars, and have different women in his house every night was just disgusting to us. All of us were bitter, even my young daughter, who he had kept up at night with his loud music and fornication, which penetrated all of our soundproofing efforts. Previously, we even tried talking to the HOA about it, but you know how they are. He paid them extra so they kept turning a blind eye to his obvious infractions. Just trust me. If you were in my shoes, I have a feeling you would understand the anger we all felt. I knew that if I could win just once, I could see the shock on his face. I could see him realize that not everything in the world is just given to people, and hard workers will prevail over arrogant, lazy slobs like him. That brings us to October 1st, 2019. This was the date the box arrived, and the date that this whole mess started. After opening the box, my daughter, Olivia, was surprisingly less scared of it than my wife, Kate. Olivia was more fascinated by it than anything. The Jenny Hanover came with instructions to hang it up and some general upkeep tips. It was all pretty much what you would expect, but the last tip was apparently very important. The text, over twice as large and bolded, stated, "Do not place in water." I thought that this was to be expected. Drying was just part of the preservation process. If it were to somehow rehydrate, it would probably start to smell like shit. That would be a good $200 down the drain. Not completely sure why, but Olivia really loved this thing that she named Herbert. She would play with it like a doll and even sleep with it. Sometimes she asked to take a bath with it, but Kate and I told her that she shouldn't because it might ruin it. One day, she wanted to take Herbert to show and tell, which we allowed if she was careful with it. Apparently all the other kids in the class and the teacher ran out screaming, and she was sent home. Even though she got in trouble, I didn't mind. That day confirmed that the Jenny Hanover would bring the exact reaction we wanted out of people. We continued the month as normal, and word began to spread around about such a terrifying object. Then came October 30th, the day before the contest. We didn't want to show our full hand before the competition, so we decided not to hang it up until Halloween. That being said, we were also afraid that Olivia would accidentally break it right before, so we hid it in a closet for the day. She was upset that she couldn't play with it, but she seemed to understand. Until the day ended, she finally started asking a lot of questions about it. "Dad, what is Herbert?" "Herbert's a dried stingray, sweetie." "Where did you get him? Why are kids so scared of him?" "I bought him online. He was supposed to be a Halloween decoration. We were actually really surprised that you weren't scared of him to begin with." "Why can't I put him in water?" "He's dried and pretty old. He'll probably start to smell bad if we do that." "Why does he ask me to bring him to the tub then?" That question definitely threw me off a little. But you know kids and their imaginations, always running wild and creating friends with things like stuffed animals. I responded about as seriously as any parent would. "Maybe he'll come to life or something. I don't know." We all went to bed early that night because we knew we would be decorating the house all day on Halloween. Around midnight, I was awakened to a scream coming from the bathroom. As I rushed to the bathroom, I noticed the closet door was open and I immediately thought I knew what happened. However, when I opened the door, the last thing I expected to see was that thing trying to pull my daughter into the water with its tail, which had become more like a tentacle. "Kate, get the gun." The thing had kept its disgusting pale color, although now it was very slimy to the touch. I could tell that this was not just a disfigured stingray anymore, but something completely different. I attempted to rip that thing's tail away from my daughter, but it was unnaturally strong. It hissed at me and tried to bite me. When Kate arrived with the gun, I immediately shot the tail to free Olivia, pushing her away from the thing. It thrashed about and let out a horrific screech as I unloaded the rest of my magazine into it. When it finally stopped moving, we took a moment to collect ourselves, and then thought of how we would get rid of it. It definitely smelled as bad as I thought it would. I decided that despite the horrible experience and the bullet holes it had, I would hang it up right away just to get it outside. If we had gone through this much with it, we might as well have gotten some use out of it. When I walked onto my porch, police officers arrived. They told me that neighbors told them to look into some gunshots that came from my house. I held up the thing, smiling, and just said, "It's okay, officers. Just a little monster in the house. You can come in if you'd like." One searched the place as the others watched me hang up the little eldritch horror beast that was my Jenny Hanover. Sir? The hell is that thing?" The officer asked with a hand on his taser. "It's called a Jenny Hanover. It's just a disfigured stingray, really." "Why the hell did you even buy that thing?" "I thought it would be a good Halloween decoration." The officer and I continued to talk while the others finished up his search. Of course, everyone was okay, if not a little bit shaken. They left without any problems, but when we tried to go back to sleep, for obvious reasons, that wasn't working out for any of us, so we all gathered at the dining room table to talk about it while having some snacks. "Hey Olivia, was that thing actually talking to you?" "It was." "What kind of things did it say?" asked Kate. "He wanted me to take a bath with him," she croaked out as she began to cry. I threw up in my mouth. After excusing myself, I went to the bathroom. There, I splashed water on my face, pinched myself, slapped myself in the face repeatedly, and forced my eyes open and closed. I did everything I could to convince myself that this wasn't happening while my wife was consoling Olivia. When I sat back down, my mind was still racing. "I'm sorry for putting you through all this," I said. "It's okay, Dad. You couldn't have known." I probably shouldn't have encouraged playing with a dead animal anyway. "Even though it was a bit weird, I can see why you did, honey. She seemed like she was having a good time. Come on, Olivia. Let's try to get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a big day," replied Kate. Only then were we able to get some sleep. The next morning, the thing was gone. I didn't really know what to think about that, but good riddance, I guess. We didn't even feel like putting up decorations that day. The following year, we sold all of the Halloween decorations we had accumulated over the years so we could afford to move to a calmer place. Here there was no Jaren. Here there was no possibility of that thing finding us. Here we could live in peace. Sometimes, though, I still think back to the incident and wonder what the fuck happened to that thing. I met Andrew in my first year of college, and as long as I've known him, he's been a major spice head. His nickname all throughout college had been the Iron Tongue. If it was spicy, he ate it. He was the kind of guy who would put hot sauce on his peppers. It was one of the things that bonded us. I love spicy food. Andrew used to invite me to eating contests filled with spicy food, and eventually we started hanging out every Friday night, eating spicy food and binging horror movies. It was one of the few things that kept me sane through the endless classes and assignments. We had gone on like that for 4 years. We were there for each other through everything. We supported each other on our journey to cross things off our bucket list. His big dream was to get into the Guinness World Record book for his tolerance to spice. Slowly but surely, I'd watched him climb the ladder of spice. I stopped trying to keep him after the world's 6th hottest pepper, the Naga Viper. But Andrew kept going. I can still remember the night he brought that thing over. It was my turn to host our movie night, and as I was prepping, Andrew came darting around the corner. He had my spare key. In his hands was a small paper bag. He bounced up and down as he told me he was finally able to get his hands on one. A Carolina Reaper. He opened the bag and I instantly recoiled. I was going to college to get my botany degree. I even grew my own peppers. And the thing he held in his hand was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was pure black and smooth. Unlike a Carolina Reaper's red, wrinkly look, and I swear it had this slight beat to it, like a heart. The thing smelled like fire and death itself. I tried to convince him that this was definitely not a normal pepper, but he didn't listen. I asked where he got it, and he told me he got it from a gypsy woman at the farmer's market. I smacked the back of his head jokingly, asking if he had learned nothing from all the horror movies we had watched. I told him it was probably some cursed item, but I silently rolled my eyes, figuring he was pranking me. Still giddy, he handed me his phone and told me to start filming. I held up the camera and filmed him as he began to talk his big game and act a fool. Then he popped a small black pepper in his mouth. Almost immediately his face turned red and he began to sweat. He clenched his fist so tight his knuckles turned white. His face puckered and his eyes watered. Then he ran to the freezer and shoved a handful of ice in his mouth. But it didn't work. I taunted him as he ran to the sink and started to glug cold water. I continued to mock all his big words and overly confident bravado as he tried to cool the flames on his tongue. He then ran to the fridge and grabbed a plastic gallon of milk. But when he brought it to his face, the plastic began to melt and the liquid began to boil. Before my eyes, the skin on his face started to melt. He tried to bring his hands up to claw at it, but as he touched his face, his fingers began to melt as well. He tried to scream, but a horrible, unholy gurgling sound ripped from his throat. His whole body began to melt into a puddle. His teeth turned to goo and his eyes melted out of his sockets. His ears drooped, and before I knew it, all that was left of my friend was a puddle. The small black pepper lay in the center of the puddle, beating more erratically than before. I haven't reported his death yet. I don't even know who to call. An ambulance? The cops? A priest? I've been staying at my parents' house ever since. The other day my neighbor called me and told me she saw someone go into my house and leave a few minutes later. I asked her what the person looked like and she told me. Some small old gypsy lady. When she left her house, she was carrying a paper bag that was moving around frantically, like it had a frog stuck in it or something. My parents have always fought. As a child, I grew used to it. They screamed and yelled and threw things at each other regularly. I used to lay in my bed with the pillow covering my ears, trying to drown out their voices. It got a little easier when my grandmother bought me a teddy bear. I loved that bear. I would take it everywhere with me, and when my parents fought, I could sit in my room, and every time I hugged the bear, the tiny pre-recorded voice inside its chest would say, "I love you, Tommy." One night, the fighting was worse than normal. The screaming was louder and the sounds of breaking glass and shattering porcelain were more violent. It was that night, clutching my favorite teddy bear, that I heard a new sound. A gunshot. A single gunshot rang through the halls of the house and everything was silent. Soon the sound of my mother sobbing and the sound of sirens broke the silence and I let out the breath I didn't know I was holding. The police found me in my bed, under the blankets, clutching my bear for dear life. After that, my life was different. I lived with my grandma for a while, but my mother was released from prison after some time and I went back to live with my mother for my teen years. It was then that strange things happening around the neighborhood. Cats and dogs went missing, people's fences were broken, and windows were left shattered. No one really knew who was doing all this and no one knew how to stop them. It never really bothered me until I started noticing some discoloration on my teddy bear. I was about 14 now, and did not play with that thing anymore, but it still stayed on my shelf because of the hard times it got me through. While playing with a football in the house, despite my mother's protests, I accidentally knocked it off the shelf and onto the floor. It landed with a splat and I went over to investigate. It was covered with a thick red substance that now spilled onto the floor. I quickly started cleaning it up, not thinking too much of it. Maybe someone spilled food on it, I thought. But I knew that couldn't have happened. To be honest, in that moment I was scared, so I cleaned it and the floor and returned everything to its place. I jumped when I heard a firm knock at the door. I was shaken, and my mother got to the door before I could gather myself to answer it. "Tina, get your kid under control," my neighbor yelled angrily as soon as the door was opened. "Whoa, wait, what did he do?" my mom asked, startled by the other woman's outburst. "I found this by my broken window. Looks like someone forgot it." She held a baseball bat in one hand and waved it around. It was my baseball bat. "Mom, it wasn't me. I swear. Last I knew that bat was in the garbage." "Uh-huh. A likely story." The neighbor scowled at me. "Thanks for telling me. I'll deal with it. You can leave the bat on the porch." My mom ended the conversation and shut the door before the neighbor could protest. After that encounter, I was thoroughly questioned about if it was me who broke the window. I'm not sure if my mom really believed me at the time, but she did after the events of the next day. Started like any other. Breakfast, conversation, and getting ready for school and work. It was when we heard the screams of our neighbors that we rushed outside to see what has happened. The street was filled with dead animals, raccoons and possums, but also dogs and cats. Every missing animal in the neighborhood was now dead and in the middle of the road. Upon further inspection, we found that each animal was mutilated in a different, unique way. Some had their eyes cut out, paws cut off, or burnt to a crisp, and other horrific things. Nobody left their homes that day. We all just sat inside until the street was cleaned and the gruesome scene was gone. What really made me sick was when I returned to my room. The thick red goo was dripping off my shelf and onto my floor. It was coming from the bear and it smelled like death. I told my mom about my suspicions and showed her the scene in my room. "This is a sick prank, Tommy. Your bear is not doing any of these things. That's nonsense," she said, almost looking disgusted with me. She accused me of doing all the horrible things and blaming it on my bear. I convinced her to help me get rid of it, if just for my own comfort. She drove me to a river the next day and I threw him in it. I watched the bear that was once my best friend slowly float downstream to get washed away with the water. After that, life had almost returned to normal. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and the town slowly started to breathe again. I wouldn't be terrorized by that thing again until my 22nd birthday. By that time, I was renting a house with my best friend and going to college. I had a girlfriend and my own car. I was living the dream. My party had just ended. A night of drinking and games and laughing had come to a close. My friends had all just left. My roommate had gone to sleep, and I was headed to bed when the doorbell rang. Who could it be at this hour? I thought. I opened the door and was surprised to see no one there. I looked down and found a box with a note on top. 4 words were scrawled on the paper with red ink. "For you. Happy birthday." I took the box inside and opened it up. My heart sank as soon as I laid eyes on the soaked teddy bear that sat inside the box. I reached out to touch it, not sure if it was really there, but before I could, it spoke. "I love you, Tommy." The audio coming from the bear was warped and distorted, glitching and dragging out the words. I took the box out behind the house to the dumpster and set it inside. I was not going to let this demonic toy back into my life. For the first time in a long time, I was happy. I was not going to let anything change that. I went to sleep thinking that the bear problem was over, but it was just beginning. I woke up to the smell of bacon and stumbled into the kitchen. "This is why you're my best friend," I said to Brian as I took a piece of bacon off the growing pile. "You're only friends with me because I make you food?" He replied with a fake frown. "Oh, anyways," he continued, "I wanted to ask, who got you that creepy-looking teddy bear last night? I found it on the couch this morning, but I don't remember you getting it at the party last night. That thing gives me chills, dude." I froze in shock. It was back? No way. I had to get rid of this thing. I briefly explained the situation to my roommate before snatching the bear off the couch and driving to a landfill. I parked the car and chucked the bear as hard as I could into the dump. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror while driving back home, a little brown bear with big button eyes was staring back at me. After that, I gave up. I couldn't get rid of this thing. I guess I would have to deal with it. Weeks passed, and I thought maybe it wouldn't be a problem. Nothing had happened so far. Until I walked into the apartment to find Brian knocked out on the floor. The fluffy figure standing over him. The bear wasn't moving. In fact, I had never seen it move, but I felt like I had caught it in the act. A broken vase from one of the high shelves lay broken on the floor next to my friend. I rushed him to the hospital to find out that he suffered a mild concussion. He said he guessed the vase had fallen on him while he was walking under it. He didn't necessarily believe me when I suggested it was the bear. It's creepy, but there's no way it threw a vase at me. That's just crazy, he stated. His words made sense. It had been the wrong place at the wrong time. But what if it was the bear? I shook the thought from my mind. That was crazy, right? I was wary about the toy for the next few days. Checking to make sure it hadn't moved and keeping it away from people when they came over became habit. It was one day when I had fallen asleep while watching a movie with my girlfriend that the nightmare began again. I was jolted from my sleep by a shrill, high-pitched screech. I ran across the room to the source, but I was too late. My girlfriend lay still on the wooden floor, eyes and mouth open in a scream, with a bloody hole in her chest. A kitchen knife, covered in blood, lay a few feet away from the corpse, right next to the innocent-looking stuffed animal. I grabbed the knife quickly away from the toy, expecting it to try to beat me to it, but it just sat there, lifeless. I tried to keep the tears from clouding my vision as I raised the knife and plunged it down towards the bear. The bear then did something I had never seen before. It moved. My roommate walked in right as the knife missed the bear and stuck in my dead girlfriend's torso. He slammed the door shut immediately, and I could hear him calling the police in the other room. There was no way out of this. No one will believe me. I sat on the floor next to my dead love and cried. I sobbed until the police came to take me away. I tried to tell the police that it wasn't me. It was the bear. But that just got me sent to the psychiatric ward of the prison. The doctors tell me that I projected my actions onto the bear, that I was responsible for everything that it did, even when I was a kid. They tell me that I'm mentally unstable and a danger to others. I don't believe a word they say. That thing has a mind of its own, and that mind is incredibly twisted. Now I live each day in my padded cell. It's not too terrible, I guess. The food isn't great, and I'm not a fan of the isolation, but at least that thing can't get me in here. At least that was what I thought. I got an anonymous package today. Security checked it, and said I could receive it. I can see a tuft of brown fur sticking out of the package, and I'm terrified to open it. I've always loved the outdoors. If it happens outside, I've tried it at least once in my life. Hiking has always been my favorite though. I'm a pretty seasoned hiker. Never really been one to stick to the beaten path. When I moved, I was excited to find a place right next to the river and the strip of sprawling woods that ran through the city I lived in. It was new terrain, and I couldn't wait to explore it. I quickly discovered that the paths that ran through the woods were the only way through in some places. If you stayed too far from the path, there were places where the woods were so dense you couldn't even crawl your way through. Not that that stopped me. Especially when I decided adding geocaching to the mix was a great way to mix things up. Geocaching is simple enough. Basically, it's a real-world treasure hunt. People hide caches and then post their coordinates online, and then other people go looking for them. Simple enough and super fun. Most caches have some cheap toy type things in them. The rule is take something, leave something. My signature thing to leave is laptop stickers and the signature Samantha Supertramp in the logbook. I haven't found every cache out there. I'm not sure that's even possible, but some of the caches right off the main path I stop at regularly to check the treasures and drop new stickers if someone has taken the one I left on my last visit. I like the idea that my stickers make someone excited. I've been doing it every weekend for a few months now, but if I had known what I was doing, I never would have revisited the same caches over and over again. A couple weeks ago, I ran out of stickers and chose some other small treasure items I had instead for my weekly adventure. This was my first concerning geocaching trip. The main trails through the parks are usually well worn, and I've always run into a few people when I find myself on the actual trails. However, the space in between the trails is wild, overgrown, and difficult to navigate. This is my favorite place to look for caches. Usually when I take these adventures, I stop at ones I know on my way into the woods, and search for new ones on my way back. This fateful trip was no different. Even without my stickers, I hit a few of my favorite regular caches. However, I found something interesting in my last on-trail cache. It was the only new item in the cache since I had visited last weekend, and the only thing missing was my sticker from last time. The object in question? It was a necklace, but it looked exactly like one I had lost years ago. Confused and a little excited, I went ahead and swapped the necklace with one of my trinkets from home. I was excited about my little coincidence, and excited to have a duplicate of something I had lost. I didn't really think anything of it as I curiously checked the logbook for the name of the person who had added the necklace, and was surprised to find someone else using the Supertramp name in the cache log. My first thought was excitement. There was someone else geocaching who might be a fan of the same book as I was. I went ahead and scribbled down Samantha Supertramp and the date on the line below, Alex Supertramp, and re-hid the cache in its hiding place. The rest of that trip was without incident, and I found some really cool new, difficult caches on my adventure. When I went out the next week, Alex hadn't been all but forgotten. After my last adventure, I had added one of my new favorite off-trail caches that I found last time to my list of caches to check back in on. When I reached it, I discovered that my trinket from last time was the only missing item, and the item that had replaced it this time was another necklace. Once again like one I had lost years ago. I pulled out the log, and sure enough, dated the same day as my last trip was Alex Supertramp. An involuntary chill ran down my spine as I stared at the name. I turned the necklace over in my hands a few times, staring at it intently. It really did look exactly like the one I had lost when I was in college. Feeling a little rattled, I stuck the necklace in my pocket and left a trinket rather than a sticker before setting out to find new caches for the day. This carried on for 3 more of my visits. Each time one of the caches I would regularly check had one new item replacing whatever I had brought. Each time it was a piece of jewelry that looked disturbingly like something I had lost. Each time, Alexander Supertramp would be scribbled in the logbook, always with the same date as my last visit. Now, you might be thinking some other geocaching enthusiast had discovered my stickers and decided to try to collect them, but their replacement items were weird. And it wasn't just because the pieces looked like ones I had owned before. These weren't cheap pieces of jewelry. In fact, one of the similar pieces looked exactly like a white gold and diamond necklace I had gotten a couple years ago for Christmas. I was so heartbroken when I lost that piece out of my gym locker. I know you're probably thinking coincidence right now. Maybe someone with very similar jewelry tastes just decided that this would be a fun way to destash one of their collections, and it was just coincidence that we always went geocaching on the same day. Or at least, that was what I told myself. After last week, I'm not sure I can keep telling myself that though. Last week, I didn't find any new jewelry from Alex in my usual caches. However, as I was discovering new caches from my list, I discovered something that sent chills down my spine. There it was. Alex Supertramp, dated the same day as my last visit. I stared at the name in disbelief before dumping the contents of the cache onto the ground. There it was, sparkling in the dirt among the usual geocache fare of small toys, keychains, and pens. A pink star opal necklace. This was a piece of my jewelry and I knew it. I had worn it last weekend when I came out. I felt panic rise in my chest. I had taken it off when I got home before I got a shower. I had been looking for it in my apartment all week after losing it, but here it was. I examined the piece more closely, looked at all the small imperfections I knew were a part of this homemade piece of jewelry, and they were all there. A small bit of blue fuzz that always manages to get itself trapped in the chain whenever I wore my blue sweater. The stone was ever so slightly off its base, and one of the prongs was ever so slightly crooked. I clenched the necklace tightly in my hands and I quickly threw everything else back in the cache and returned it to its hiding place. I didn't even bother to sign the logbook. I was on edge my whole trip back, checking over my shoulder every couple of minutes and jumping any time the trees rustled. Alex was out here somewhere, and for all I know, they were following me. Back home, I tore my apartment apart looking for the necklace I had found out in that cache, but it was still missing. I felt violated, and I didn't even know what to do about it. What would the police care? It's not like I had actual proof that this was my necklace, or that it had somehow been stolen out of my apartment. Since my last discovery, I haven't been out to geocache or even hike. I paid the extra fees to hook up the alarm system in my apartment. So far, I haven't noticed anything new turning up missing, but I'm waiting for the day Alex Supertramp just shows up on my doorstep. I guess I will just start with telling you guys the first time that I had an encounter with these beings. It all started when my family moved into a house on the opposite side of town. It is decently larger than our first home in this town. It had a small backyard with an unusually tall fence, and behind that fence lied a hill before there was a large forest. As I am the second oldest, I got my own room on the condition that I didn't personalize my room too much so my parents could use it as a guest room. I was fine with this because I had a room all to myself most of the time. But it turns out I was never really alone. At the time we had 2 dogs who both died of unseen causes. They were a few years apart, but it seemed they died from unknown causes in the middle of the night. The dogs weren't the only things that would mysteriously end up dead when the sun rose and the family woke. I had received 20 guppies from a friend who had too many. They lasted for 3 years until they started disappearing. I would wake up and there would be just 1 less than there was the previous night, and then there was 10 left. They all died. I woke up to find them all on the top floating there. Some had bloated so much they exploded. This was obviously devastating for me as a child, but it was my parents' actions after the fact that made it so much worse now that this has happened. They buried both of our dogs in the woods behind the house, which isn't odd, but they also made me bury the fish there. Then they would call that priest to come bless the house, and that's when I became more aware of my surroundings. About a month after the priest blessed my house, I would start to see the shadows not quite mimicking the right form. Around month 3, I would start to feel the mirrors watching me. Nothing major really happened until the 2-year mark. That was when my closet doors would randomly open in the middle of the night. My brother would sleepwalk into my room and just stand there, but when I woke up, he would either just collapse or he would run off sprinting into his own room and not remember any of it the next morning. I would start to see my reflection in the mirror ripple or distort. At the 3-year mark, I would catch glimpses of shadows moving on their own, or a few items in my room misplaced, and like most people with younger siblings, I never was concerned because anytime I would see the shadows moving, I would ask my older brother and he would say he couldn't see anything. And that comforted me. But how naive I was. After a few years of living there in that room, I would sometimes wake up to find my closet door slightly ajar, and my room was impossibly cold and it smelled off, but after a few minutes the smell would fade. I should probably mention that we used to have a priest come to our house every 2 years, and he would bless our entire house. However, at this time we hadn't had a priest bless our home in around 3 years. One night I had woken up and the room was off. It looked almost exactly like my room down to the very detail, but my paintings looked like they were copies. Work that wasn't my own. So as a kid who didn't know better, I went to turn my light on to investigate, but my light wouldn't turn on, so I walked into the hallway to turn on that light, and it wouldn't turn on. My bathroom door then slammed with a loud bang, and in my panic I used all my strength to pry the door open to get inside, but once I opened the door, there was this thing. It was in the middle of crawling out of my mirror. I froze in terror as this thing dragged itself out of the mirror. In its efforts, it bumped a glass figure I had on the floor, and as it shattered, I also broke out of my stupor and felt the terror as its blank, featureless face gazed into my soul. I ran as fast as my legs could take me out of the back door, and through the back gate into the woods. I ran, I tripped, fell in mud, and felt branches tearing at my clothes. I couldn't see where I was going. I still remember my heart pounding in my head as I stumbled into a small clearing of trees. The thing that had chased me out of the house slammed into an invisible barrier. This thing was horrible. It stalked around the clearing, blending in with the tall, thin poplar trees. But I could still feel its eyeless face hungering for my soul. As I cowered in the middle of the clearing, and I took some time to notice that the clearing was a large pentagram burned into the grass. And in the middle was a tree with a small wooden box attached to it that resembled a birdhouse that had an emblem on the side. It resembled a circle with an X. Etched into it on the inside was a weathered piece of paper along with a pencil. The sheet of paper had water stains, and the ink was slightly smudged, but that didn't really matter because the words were written, and that was all I really needed. Here's what it said. Hello. If you are reading this, I sincerely apologize. The fact that you are reading this means that the seal that held the shadows has broken. The chances that you aren't the first of the victims is very slim. I left a set of rules to follow with the realtor, and I guess the fact that you are here means the realtor didn't listen and give you the set of rules. So here's the original. 1. If the shadows start moving, walk the opposite way and ignore them. If you don't, they will reach out to consume you. 2. In the basement, when you feel a presence, don't go down. If you don't, be surprised if you find that creature wandering around. 3. If you have the large room downstairs, place a stool or chair in front of the closet. You don't want to be in there if that thing comes out. Always have a cross on your door, over your window, and a rosary blessed by a priest on your mirror. 4. For the large room upstairs, never look in the attic. If you feel a presence in the room anytime past 12:03 a.m., don't move until you feel the presence has left. 5. Always leave a nightlight on. 6. On the night of the full moon, always wear a cross and sprinkle your entire room with holy water. Place salt in your doorway and in your window. 7. Have a priest bless your home every 2 years. No more, no less. 8. If you end up not following the rules and you are chased by the white mirror man, run to the clearing with the pentagram. It will seal the creature out and keep you in until the sun rises. If you don't follow these rules, especially number 7, you will end up in the same situation as tonight, but the creature will memorize your path and it will eventually catch you. You have been warned. I sat in the clearing crying as I waited for the sun to breach the horizon, screaming and jumping out of my skin anytime the creature made a lunge at the invisible barrier in between us, keeping me safe as the sun took its time reaching the horizon. As I waited for the sun to rise, I spent my time watching the woods and memorizing the rules, and I could feel my entire body relax as the sun appeared over the horizon, as the sun rose and the trees returned around me as the burn mark faded. I walked home through the trees and I snuck in through my window, and I fell asleep from pure exhaustion, and I was awoken by my alarm 3 hours later. I thought it may have just been a crazy dream, but the cuts and dirt on my arms, legs, and the small glass figurine smashed to bits beside my mirror. To this day, I still follow these rules, but I also find that once every month, when there is a full moon, it's good to just head straight for the clearing before the creature awakens to hunt you down. The Lockley Tavern started as any other tavern, just a place for people to drink and share stories. However, the Lockley morphed into something else over time. Long gone were the light-hearted stories of damsels in distress and stopping a would-be robber. Now the stories told here are much darker. The tavern has become a place for damsels who stayed in distress at the hands of things and the people who found themselves at the hands of the robbers or other such monsters. I can't give you a specific address to find Lockley's as the location changes. You see, you don't find us, we find you. The tavern will make itself known to those in need of a drink and get their story into the open. I go by Locke, and I'm the bartender / owner of this joint. I fix stiff drinks and listen to people's stories. Through my own experiences and what I've heard, I've learned a few things about what goes bump in the night, and I've decided to share the knowledge. Names of the patrons are not known and thus will not be shared. Continue to read at your own risk. Knowing what's out there may make you more susceptible. I'll begin with the least disarming story told to me this far. This is an introduction to my world. If this is too much for you, I suggest not reading anymore. It was a typical night. I didn't know where I was, and I can't remember the last time I did. When my patrons come in, I don't ask about whereabouts, names, or any identifying information. I hardly talk at all. I was wiping down the countertop and ensuring cleanliness, as most customers can't relax enough to tell their story if they are focusing on grime. A young man came in looking slightly confused, as they usually do. He cautiously approached the bar and asked where he was. "Why, old friend, you're at Lockley's Tavern. What can I pour for you?" I greeted the man as I have greeted many before him. The man looked almost more confused but mumbled out that he would have a Jack and Coke. I nodded and smiled at him. "Your usual, eh? How have you been?" I try to make the patrons feel welcome and at ease. Sometimes in their state, it's easier to do so if they believe we have met before. He smiles a small, sad smile, glances at the name tag on my chest and responds, "Well, Locke, not too good, but I doubt you'd believe me." I set his drink in front of him and say, "Try me." His story began during the day. He woke up feeling as though he were being watched. A solid hour before his alarm usually went off. Looking around the room, he couldn't find anything, but the feeling persisted. So he chose to start his day early, having a wash-up first thing off, putting when you feel like something is taking a gander at your goods. Quickly getting dressed, he popped into the kitchen to grab a quick bite. Though when he first rounded the corner into the room, he could have sworn he thought he saw something standing next to the fridge for a split second before he could actually focus on it. Blaming the vision on his sleep-addled brain, he quickly made coffee and his breakfast, though he mentioned that he tried to not turn his back to the area where he saw the thing. He was already so on edge from the walk to the bus stop that when he got on the bus, he looked at everyone as if they were the ones staring. His day went on like this. Every so often, he would see a creature out the corner of his eye and constantly felt eyes on him. He told me that while he was freaked out and had anxiety all day because of this, things didn't take a turn for the worst until he got off at his bus stop after work. The sun was already down and multiple streetlights leading home hadn't been working for a while. As soon as the bus pulled away from the curb, he felt he was in serious trouble. His fight or flight response kicked in, and he knew he needed to get out of there, but didn't know in what direction he should go. He looked around frantically for a clue. And that's when he spotted it. The creature was humanoid and covered in eyes from head to toe. All the eyes moved in different directions from each other. He called it just a plain old monster. But that's vague. And as someone who's seen it, we call it the Watcher. It feeds off your fear for however long it chooses, and then it kills you and adds your eyes to its collection. He told me that he immediately pivoted and ran in the opposite direction after he saw it, not looking back. He ran until he found a crowded place, which just so happened to be a club. In a small, ashamed voice, he informed me that his hope was to lure the monster in there, where it would hopefully choose a new victim. His plan seemed to have worked, as he no longer had the constant feeling of being watched. Even still, he dared not go home. Instead, he just walked around all night, hoping to never feel those eyes on him again. When finally up to the task of returning home, he did so, but no longer felt at ease there. A few restless nights go by, and then while reading the newspaper, he sees that the body of a woman who had gone missing a few nights before at a club had been found. She had been torn apart and her eyes were missing. He said it was all his fault for luring the monster into the club to hook a new victim, and that he hadn't been able to rest since. He had drunk 3 Jack and Cokes by the time he finished his story, and I gave him my condolences and assurances that he reacted in the only way he knew how to save his own life. This reassured him somehow, and he stated that he would like to go home. You're free to leave any time, old friend. Be more mindful of your surroundings. If you see the Watcher again, watch it first. I always try to give my patrons a bit of advice before they leave. Who knows if they remember it by the following day. After the man left, I wrote up a new sign and drew a crude picture of the Watcher and added it to my wall of bounties. You see, not only is my tavern for the lost and damaged, but it's also for the people who hunt the monsters. It's rare, but it happens. Every now and then, a survivor stumbles into my path, and they dispatch their would-be killer. At this, I offer them a new life and ask them to help stop the evil that exists out there. This is the Lockley Tavern, where our doors are always open and drinks constantly flowing for those in need of an ear to bend. And remember, my friends, if you ever feel like you are being watched, you probably are. Find the source before it finds you. I have withheld a secret so terrible that it cannot possibly be confined in any other living being on this earth. A secret that has gnawed at me for the past 7 months, that continues to suck the life out of me with the passing of each day. And now it has consumed my soul entirely. Dreams of that cursed place have certainly played a part, and I find that not even sleep can serve as an escape from the horror that makes its presence known in the back of my mind. I've learned that some secrets don't stay buried, and they will wait with endless, deadly patience until they get what they desire. I write this in a state of hopelessness and defeat, but also with acceptance of my fate and whatever fate has in store for me beyond that. I cannot avoid these forces that refuse to rest forever. I brought this upon myself. I must accept responsibility for my horrifying actions. I write this because I simply cannot let this secret eat me from the inside out any longer, and I realize that it is time to open the cursed gates of my soul and let whatever dark poison that dwells within spill out onto this page. Ink has never been so black. I might as well quit dancing around the details and finally shed light on what truly exists among the crooked trees of Blackthorne woods. This nameless evil does not stem from ancient tales of evil entities passed down through the eons. Neither is it facts twisted into unbelievable fiction like these certain tales. What now dwells within the cursed woods is all too real, and is a direct product of my unforgivable actions. I suppose I should begin by addressing the innocent person who incited the chain of horrors that eventually led to the demise of both of us in the long run. If Jonathan Gedney had never stepped foot into Blackthorne, then I could guarantee his longevity, but I cannot guarantee my own either way. Jonathan Gedney was a college student studying journalism from Gridlock University and had wished to do an article on the history of Blackthorne. Since I am the chief of the pitiful police force of this town, he assumed I would be the best choice to draw information from. The ghost stories that are woven throughout the town's past aren't exactly unknown by the surrounding towns, but attempts have been made to hush them up enough to where clear details are often hazy, and sometimes vacant altogether. These hidden pieces of information are what fuels the curiosity of people like Jonathan Gedney, and therefore, they are what brought him to my front doorstep. When he first introduced himself to me, he made clear that he wanted as much information as possible. His goal must have been to write a piece that would contain secrets that no other inquiring outsider had ever been able to attain. I didn't have the heart to tell him that no method of prying would achieve anything better than the fools before him. Hollow dreams of fame and recognition is what he sought ultimately, but no ordinary man could crack open the tomb of secrets that have been carefully preserved by the town itself for centuries. These stories began in the late 1600s, when the fear of witches were rampant, and where many women were executed without mercy. Salem suffered a very similar ordeal, but Blackthorne didn't ever make it into the history books, due to how the isolated nature of the town made it difficult for information to escape. One particular witch stood out among the others, killing more men and children than any other of her kind and evading capture 8 times. When she was finally bound and shackled and brought to the gallows in front of the leering townspeople, she screamed a torrent of curses upon the town that were supposedly heard in the next town over. This period was certainly the darkest stain in Blackthorne's history, and many people refused to acknowledge it altogether. However, there was an odd event that occurred centuries later in the early 1800s that stirred up whispers about certain dark forces that appeared to have the town gripped in their claws. Mayor John Lockley had just been voted into office, defeating his opponent, James Fry. Lockley was a man who indulged in fashion, and his choice of clothing often served as a strategy to direct attention towards himself. He could often be seen wearing a blue suit that accomplished this without difficulty. Lockley's boasts about his achievements were often unchecked, so when he went missing soon after the election, many people suspected that he was murdered. James Fry took office soon afterwards, but many people noticed his increased anxiety and paranoia. His mental state only got worse from there, and supposedly he had complained to a few colleagues about strange recurring nightmares that wouldn't release their hold on him. A week later, he was last seen walking quickly towards the woods, and it was queer to the townspeople that he never once stopped to acknowledge anyone who sent a greeting in his direction. He was never seen again. These old tales could have piqued Gedney's interest, yet there was a specific story he specifically asked for. At the mention of it, I immediately became overwhelmed with raw fear, twisted with panic to form a shapeless mass of emotion that pulsed within my heart. He asked with such innocence, not knowing the full weight of his words on my fragile shoulders. "Tell me the story everyone wants to know," he said. "Tell me about the children of Blackthorne Woods." Somehow I kept my composure, and I was quite proud that I was able to answer him without a trace of a nervous quiver in my voice. I politely refused, attributing my unhelpfulness to a lack of knowledge in the subject, even though I knew the story better than anyone in the town. He persisted, and even went so far as to request my presence at a guide for a trip into those haunted woods itself. He explained his intentions as wanting to be able to experience the atmosphere, so he could better describe it in his piece. At first, I declined a bit more forcefully. The thought of those woods alone gave me chills to the bone, but to step foot in them was a new level of horror altogether. I swore 7 months ago that I would never grace those evil woods with my presence ever again. However, Jonathan Gedney was not easily dissuaded. He pleaded with me, almost, saying that it would not take long, that he would be in and out before I knew it. I think he sensed my fear of that dreaded place, even if he didn't fully understand where the fear stemmed from. I am not proud to say that I complied sooner than what I would have wanted. Already, I was viewing Jonathan Gedney as a personal curse, sent from the maniacal gods of fate that were laughing hysterically at my expense. I tried to convince myself that maybe this arrogant youth was right, and maybe nothing bad would come from this trip into the woods. Witnesses later said that they saw us approaching the woods at 6:30, the sun casting its blood-red glow over the silent town as it began its slow descent. As we walked towards the looming tree line of Blackthorne woods that waited silently for us, I began to fill Jonathan in on the series of horrors that shook the town to its core 7 months ago. I began by explaining that the woods served as for the majority of the children who grew up in the quiet town of Blackthorne. The children would attend their classes at the small secondary school during the day, anxiously waiting until dismissal. Then, the rest of the evening was spent in the woods, where most of the children would congregate and play games together in the dying light of the sun until the street lamps flickered on, effectively calling them home. Parents trusted them, and trusted that they would be safe. They had no reason to think otherwise. What exactly happened, nobody truly knows. Afterwards, most people assumed it was an accident, that it was a rabies-crazed animal, because no other evidence could be found except for a blood-soaked tatter of clothing. As for the children themselves, the only eyewitness to the horror that occurred within the woods, no information could be pried from their lips. This is what drove my own curiosity to new depths, and it is what made me question the true cause of what happened. If it was merely an accident, why were the children so damned silent? What was preventing them from spilling the details of a killing they had nothing to do with? I had no proof of any other explanation, but I could not let this case close completely. I was driven by a need for justice for the victim, and I would do anything to attain it. For the victim was my very own son. His body was never found, contributing to the theory of a wild animal attack. I had suspected that one of those evil children had killed him, and one certain child came to mind, Vincent Bradford, an ever-present shadow upon all the other children's lives, ruled the schoolyard out of fear. He was a bully, simply put, and the full extent of the darkness within his soul was unknown. He was unpredictable, and some of his teachers had expressed concerns about his mental health. I believe that he could be capable of murder, even if it wasn't intentional. A sharp stake in the ground, a shovel, and a twisted root sticking out of the ground could be enough for a recipe of disaster. But as I have stated before, I had no proof, and therefore my theories fell upon deaf ears, and I was forced into silence. The parents of the children were soon reassured by a sweeping of the woods for wild animals, which revealed that whatever fanged monstrosity had dared to approach the children on that horrible day had vanished, and the children were hesitantly allowed to return to the woods once again. A second tragedy struck the town immediately after, which proved my earlier theories invalid. Despite the search for any traces of wild animals within Blackthorne woods, a second child had disappeared the same way as the first. This child was Vincent Bradley, and upon learning the name of the victim, I was forced to disregard the possibility of him being behind the murder of my son. This time, the children were less restrained when it came to the details of the event, as if something that had previously compelled them to withhold information had lifted its hold on them, and therefore loosening their tongues. Although this was a good sign, their statements soon proved to be just as useful as when they had refused to say anything at all. The most common shred of information that we could derive from their absurd descriptions was that they had all witnessed a tall man and a boy with black eyes take Vincent in some violent manner that was too terrible for them to put into words. Afterwards, the children would sit in silence with wide eyes, refusing to say another word. It was clear that whatever they had truly seen, it had scared them on a level deep enough for their experience to be traumatic. But the horrors had not yet relinquished their hold on the town, and the horrible climax transpired in silence. The children returned to the woods once more, but that would forever be known as a fatal mistake. For all the children vanished without a trace this time, leaving the town reeling. This time there was a doubt that a wild animal was responsible. The possibility of the children getting lost was also deemed unrealistic by the town, as the chances of the entire group getting lost at once was near impossible, which raised the burning question that has never left the minds of all the grieving parents since that day. Who or what could be responsible? By the time I had finished telling Gedney about the horrors intertwined with Blackthorne's past, we had entered the haunted woods themselves, which seemed to be at the heart of every tale this town had to offer. The woods were a chilling place for anyone, I realized, as I watched Gedney's uneasiness increase by the minute. The woods were a scene from a nightmare. The ground was littered with broken and weathered toys from the lost children, the only witnesses to the terrible events that occurred in those woods. The picture was one of quiet abandonment, dirt-smudged teddy bears with their eyes or limbs missing, cracked wooden soldiers lying forgotten on the cursed battlefield among the overgrown weeds, and old toy cars that had no one left to push them along the cursed soil. Gedney was oddly silent throughout the retelling of the stories, and he captured photographs with a manner of urgency, as if, now that he was finally in the woods, he wanted to be out as soon as possible. I, too, was nervous, but for reasons that he couldn't have known. Bringing up the topic of those children had also brought back all the fear that had been overwhelming my mind ever since it had happened. I had been trying to force the thought of those children out of my head for a long while. Now that I was facing it head on again, I became aware of the nervous tremors that were making themselves known along my spine. Gedney eventually broke the silence by asking a few questions, which was expected, considering he was here to write an article about the town in the first place. He inquired about if there were any new leads, to which I answered in the negative. I was visibly tense at this point, and my level of nervousness was only climbing higher, which contributed to the horrifying scene that unfolded next. I came to a point where it was hard for me to recall the events that followed, not because they have slipped from my memory, but because they have been deliberately bricked up in the vaults of my mind to prevent me from going mad. Even now, I wonder if what I saw was a delusion, triggered by the extreme act that I committed. I certainly hope so. But as I now review the horrible sight that I beheld, I can't help but to realize how the pieces fit together in a way to suggest horrors beyond comprehension. If what I saw and assume from it is true, the Blackthorne Woods must be an entity of evil in itself, and should be avoided at all costs. In my defense, my mental state was not at its best, due to the chilling atmosphere of that cursed place. My paranoia was at a dangerous level, and it was ultimately caused the death of an innocent man within Blackthorne Woods. Jonathan Gedney had been asking me a series of questions that made sense for the article he was aspiring to write, and his last inquiry was one of innocence as well. He simply wondered out loud if the children could have possibly been murdered. What we both didn't expect was my response. My paranoia, anxiety, and fear all swelled to a point that proved to be too much for my sanity. The next few moments were a blur, yet I remember every detail that followed. I remember his eyes staring into mine, his expression of shock mirroring my own. His hands clawed feebly at his throat, and then I realized that he was trying to pry my hands away without success. I was strangling him, horrified that I was doing so, yet I couldn't stop. He knew somehow. He knew. And I couldn't let him escape those woods. He would tell. I knew he would, because he knew. I killed those children 7 months ago. Their blood is on my hands, and no matter how many times I wash them, it never fades. I killed them, but I never meant to. All I wanted was to identify whoever committed those cursed acts of murder within those shadowed woods. I knew it was no animal that took my son away from me. Anger overwhelmed me that day when I silently ventured into the woods and confronted those children all at once. Anger is what killed those children, not I. Anger at their silence, at their secretiveness. They knew what happened and they refused to tell me. How is any man expected to withhold his agony of being unable to find his son's killer? Have mercy. Mercy cannot be given to those who do not give answers to a grieving father. Mercy will not be given to a man who might know a murderer's secrets. I am not certain how long I stood over Gedney's limp body in the silent woods, my sanity struggling to knit itself back together. Twilight had settled over the town and my eyes struggled to see my surroundings clearly. Perhaps it was an illusion that occurred next, for my state of mind was not at its best. But even if it was so, it doesn't explain the persistent dreams that haunt my mind in the dead of night. The first hint that I was not alone any longer came in the form of rustling in the undergrowth to my left. It started rather violently, so deep into my twisting thoughts and emotions that I had quite forgotten where I was. The rustling slowly became more prominent, and I soon realized that it was also coming from the opposite direction as well. Before long, it seemed as if the entire area was alive with movement in the undergrowth. I waited anxiously with bated breath to glimpse whatever was emerging, oddly curious rather than afraid. It appeared suddenly, sniffling and grunting as it blindly groped its way out of the undergrowth. Its movements were slow and jerky, like it wasn't quite familiar with its own form. My first perception of it was an animal of sorts, judging from the way it walked on all fours. Its pale skin was stretched tight over its bones, and as my eyes viewed its face, I had the queer sensation that I was dreaming all of a sudden. My impression that it was somehow blind was evidently correct, for two black sockets stared at me where the eyes should have been. When my horrified gaze shifted to the lower half of its face, however, my sanity fully departed once again, and the rest of the events are hard for me to determine whether they were real or not. I have mentioned already that I believe that this episode could have been a delusion, and those who read this after I have disappeared will most likely determine that it was nothing more. This is understandable because to try and accept that these events were real is to accept the onslaught of madness itself. I often think that I am mad, and if I am, I shall also state that madness is bliss compared to facing the horrors that dwell within Blackthorne woods. The mouth, if one could call that appendage such a thing, was a protruding mass of flesh and gums with yellow teeth bursting chaotically from the opening. The opening of the jaws were positioned vertically, possessing a hauntingly similarity to a grotesque version of an insect's mandibles. They opened and shut with a wet-sounding snap, strings of drool dangling from the opening. But the most terrifying aspect of the creature was the way it somehow appeared human. I must slow down now and choose my words carefully. The most human-like quality about them that brought on upon a fresh wave of horror was the fact that the creature was wearing clothing, an incredibly non-animalistic attribute. But what sent my mind spiraling into confusion and panic was the clothing itself. It was wearing ripped, dirt-stained children's apparel, like something that a young student might wear. The thing crawled slowly across the soil, sniffing curiously at Jonathan Gedney's body, but a moment of confusion swept over me as I noticed that the undergrowth around me was still rustling. And then the true horror came, and I was unable to contain the scream of fear that burst unforeseen from my lips. The woods were alive around me with movement, and soon I was able to see why. Where the first thing had emerged from the undergrowth, more were now following suit. They scurried like overgrown rats, a writhing mass of pale bodies dressed in children's clothing. The wet snaps and clicks of their jaws I shall never forget, and it is that sound in my endless nightmares that causes me to awaken in a maelstrom of terror in the dead of night. I stood among them, paralyzed with fear, unable to fully comprehend what I was seeing. None of them fully took notice of me, for which I am grateful. Instead, they seemed to be focused on curiously exploring the body of Jonathan Gedney, which I had forgotten was there in light of the other events which had taken place. One thing that sparked my curiosity was that one of the creatures was in the same in appearance, yet it was considerably larger, and it wore a faded blue outfit that might have once been called a suit. Shock coursed through my veins as, all of a sudden, they began to feed. Their mandibles clamped tightly on Gedney's arms and legs, tearing strips of flesh from his body with horrifying voraciousness. But the true shock came a moment later when a long groan split the air, and I watched as Jonathan Gedney's eyes flashed open to behold a nightmare. I realized then with yet another wave of unspeakable horror that my attempts of strangling him must have only succeeded in sinking him into unconsciousness. I think Gedney would have screamed then, if it had not been for the large portion of his throat being torn out by one of those hellish demons at that moment. This time I watched as his life drained from his body in a torrent of red. He reached out for me in those last few moments with a tense hand. His tendons strained against the taut skin. His eyes pleaded with me, his attacker, to save him. He wanted me to save him. How could I save him when I couldn't even do the same for my soul? Oddly, the humanoid creatures didn't seem to have the slightest interest in me at the moment. They were entirely focused on their prey, and even when they sometimes turned to stare at me with their hollow sockets that were cast in shadow, their gaze seemed cast with curiosity, rather than hostility. Nonetheless, I felt a creeping chill along my spine whenever they looked at me, which came with the overwhelming urge to flee. Yet I could not move. I was frozen, watching the horror unfold before my disbelieving eyes. One of the children stood up suddenly, and it was horrifying to see the creature behave so human-like. It stared at me with the same interest as the others, but its gaze lingered much longer. Its mandibles clicked, as if it was attempting to speak. The guttural sound that came forth from that hideous appendage broke the spell that had been rooting me in place, and I scrambled out of those forbidden woods in a blind panic. I don't remember much after that, but I think I made it back to my home safely because the next morning I awoke in my bed, as the entire episode had been nothing but a terrible dream. But I soon recalled the syllables uttered by that childlike being in the woods the night before, and I abruptly sank into a fit of delirium that did not release its hold on my exhausted mind for several hours. I swear upon Jonathan Gedney's body that the word I heard produced from those hideous mandibles of that childlike monstrosity was Daddy. That night will forever be ingrained in my memory, and the conclusions that I drew from the things I witnessed still threaten to overwhelm me in madness. I cannot explain what Blackthorne Woods is, or how those creatures came to be, but I can guess at what dwells within. I must only hint at what I believe the terrible truth is. For your sake, you must know the truth, so that no other soul becomes lost to those cursed woods. Burn them, if you must, but never go within to face the horrors that reside there. The Blackthorne Woods, a parasite that has buried its roots deep within Blackthorne soil, feeds on those who are far too gone. It hunts the souls who have destroyed themselves with guilt, and it feeds on whoever else meets an untimely end within the woods. It is always waiting, like a spider in its web, for a soul to wander along unsuspectedly and fall into the tangle of horrors that soon prove inescapable by mortal means. There is a space, one might call it a net of sorts, between life and the afterlife, and this space is called Blackthorne Woods. Weak souls are taken advantage of and trapped forever in a state of constant restlessness and hunger for vengeance. I have now become entwined with the black magic of that cursed place at the edge of town, and I accept the fact that I will sacrifice my soul to the inevitable fate of Blackthorne Woods. I now wonder if those woods grow stronger with each feeding, because ever since I left Jonathan Gedney to the mercy of those creatures, my recurring nightmares have grown unbearable. I see those children that I murdered all those months ago, and sometimes their faces blur between their mortal features and the twisted black-eyed mask that Blackthorne Woods has given them. My son stands with them, and I have even glimpsed Gedney among their numbers. and the blue man lingers in the background, his hollow sockets leaving no excuse for the centuries he has witnessed come to pass. The gridlock police are questioning me. They wonder where their missing college student has gone. They do not suspect me yet, but they will eventually. I know it. I have no happy endings, no matter what path I take. They wait. What is any mortal man to do in my place, under such compelling forces that continue to render humanity defenseless to its curse? I go to them today. I cannot take another night of the dreams. I am on the wrong side of this curse, as James Fry was all those centuries ago. I have confessed, and still the dreams do not relent, which must mean that my fate is unavoidable. I must go today, and when I do, I shall face those cursed children that hunger for my soul. My son shall be there, and I believe that Jonathan Gedney now waits for me as well. Who knows where a killer's soul goes, but there is no time to speculate. I can hear them now, calling my name in a dreadful whisper, calling me to their final domain. The moment has come, and as I write my final words upon this page, I realize that I was never to go further than this. My fate was predetermined. There is no other explanation. I have always belonged there. I belong to the children of Blackthorne Woods. I used to love sleeping with my blinds open so I could see the moon and the stars. There was something comforting about the glow of the moon shining on my bed while I drifted off into sleep. It made my life feel so much bigger than it was. My friends in the city thought it was a weird thing to do. In hindsight, I don't blame them in the slightest. It was a very vulnerable habit if you thought about it for a moment. I assured them, however, that I was just fine and that it was actually quite nice to sleep with the stars every once in a while. Besides, I have done it all my life. Sometimes on a warm night, I will even leave the window open just an inch. Leaving the blinds open all day and all night was just something I did without thought. It never really bothered me until recently. Actually, bothered isn't the right word. I don't think there will ever be a right word to describe how I feel about it now. Nevertheless, I was perfectly happy to sleep that way. You see, I live in a rural area. My town is not so densely populated, and I know most of my neighbors quite well. The crime rate is next to nothing, and there haven't been reports of any dangerous wildlife in years. With coincidence, I could say that where I am is probably one of the safest places you could live. It's quiet here. That might be why this whole ordeal is so much worse. If it wasn't so quiet, I might not have noticed. For years on end without hesitation, I have gone to sleep with my blinds open. My bedroom rests at the back of the house, overlooking my yard. My property stretches for miles through dense woods and small rivers. During the day it is beautiful, but now, during the night, I forbid myself to take even a peek through the long, scrawny trees that hide what could be lurking in the darkness. It would be a good idea to explain myself now. I have been putting it off. I hate to even think that this isn't a dream. I wish it were. I wish it were just another nightmare. Something I can learn to forget and move on from. Sorry, it's hard to talk about. I just need some time. Another thing about where I live is that strangely, the weather is almost always perfect, with the exception of a thunderstorm here and there. Other than that, the sky is mostly clear, and the wind blows low. Quite unfortunate. I wish it had been raining that night. Maybe I wouldn't have heard. I used to love sleeping with the blinds open. Nothing about it bothered me. I was completely safe, and I enjoyed the glow of the moon. Until 3 nights ago. On a night just like any other, I settled into bed after a long day. The weather was fine. The lights were off. My blinds were open. After a solid half hour of trying to fall asleep, my body finally gave in and I was out like a light. I don't know if by that time it was already there, or it came sometime in my sleep. At about 3 in the morning, I woke up to a tapping sound. I turned to see what was making the noise, but when I looked up at my window, it had stopped. I shrugged it off. Must have been just a slight pickup of wind that was rattling something against the glass. Rolling back onto my side, facing away from the window, I tried to go back to sleep. About 3 minutes later, I heard the tapping sound again. Tap, tap, tap. It was the same sound as a few moments prior, which made me whip my head around once more to check for a source of noise. Again, once I looked at the window, the sound froze and everything was silent once more. I decided to inspect the glass around my window to see what the issue was. Upon inspection, I did not find a trace of any sticks, branches, or animals that could have been causing the tapping sound. I laid back down on my bed, only this time, I struggled to get back into my sleep. I couldn't help but feel uneasy. Uneasy at the thought of the tapping sound. Uneasy at the thought of silence. Tap, tap, tap. I should have just tried to go back to sleep. Put up with the unexplained sound. I wish I had have just ignored it. Kept my eyes shut and pretended it was a dream. But as you can guess, I didn't. While I lay on my back staring up at the shadows cast against the roof by my dusty fan, I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. There was a chill that suddenly seized the air in my room. Upon every exhale came faint traces of vapor from my warm breath against the cold. My skin crawled and my ears felt strange. Worst of all, I had a sudden urge to turn my head to the right, to face my window once again. As tempting as it was, every instinct within me screamed not to turn my face towards the window. The more I fought at this urge, the more my hair stood on end, the more the space around my throat tightened. I can barely describe it, but I felt like every exposed part of my body was being watched. Without seeing, hearing, or even knowing for sure, I felt the burning eyes of something gazing at my uncovered face. I tried to move my hands to hide my head with my blanket, but I couldn't. The only thing my body wanted to do was look. I wanted to look so badly. My head was throbbing. My skin was crawling. I had to look at it, whatever it was. I heard loud tapping on the glass again. This time the sound was accompanied by shallow breathing. Hollow, drawn-out breaths that sent chills through my whole body. I wanted to look so badly. I can't even describe to you how badly I wanted to look. For hours I lay there, in the cold, listening to the tapping and breathing of whatever was outside my window. I wanted it to leave me alone. I wanted to die. Maybe if I looked, I would wake up from my nightmare. I don't know how long I was there, but eventually the sun came up and I was finally able to move my own body. As soon as I noticed I could move, I also noticed that the tapping and breathing had disappeared. It took a lot for me to finally look at the window. There was nothing there. I used to love sleeping with the blinds open. Every night, resting under the watch of the moon. I still sleep with the blinds open. I have no choice. Every night I fall asleep under the gaze of something I will never be able to describe to you. You'll just have to see it for yourself. Try sleeping with them open tonight. Please, can you tell me what it looks like? I'm too afraid to look. I'm hiding in the woods writing this on my phone, hiding from whatever is chasing me. I live on a fairly sized ranch somewhere in Colorado, so lots of uneven ground and tall hills around me. For the past week I've been hearing distorted classical music. Some days I can barely hear it, and other times it sounds like it's right outside my house. The scariest days, though, are when I can't hear it at all. 3 days ago when I was tending to my garden, I saw it. It was on top of the hill behind my house, looking at me like I was prey. It was tall, really tall, maybe 8 feet hunched over, charcoal black skin. It had long fingers dripping with blood. It had an old companion radio firmly planted in its chest, softly playing that damn music. And its eyes, God, the eyes. They will forever be burned into my mind. Its eyes were dull yet bright yellow, never blinking. I could tell they were bloodshot even though we were at least 150 feet, if not 200 away. A shiver ran through my spine. I called my dog and we went inside. I was too scared to do anything except cry and keep my gun trained on my door. You got my dog. 2 days ago I found my dog with its head completely severed. After what I saw the day before, I wasn't trying to leave my house, but the music started playing again and my dog went crazy and jumped through the window and ran into the woods. I tried calling him, but he wouldn't come. A few hours after, I patched my window up with some cardboard and duct tape. I heard a huge thud on the side of my house, so I went and checked with my 357. There was my dog. The worst part was, it was perfectly clean cut, like a surgeon did it. Yesterday I buried my dog. He was a gorgeous Great Dane I named Daniel. I don't know what I was thinking when I named him that. He had dark brown fur and bright blue eyes. The music was getting closer. Earlier tonight I heard it. It was in my house, right outside my door, playing that fucking music. It was mocking me. I panicked, grabbed my gun and quietly opened my window and jumped out. The exact second my feet hit the ground, I heard the music stop and it was shortly replaced with screaming. Loud screaming. I don't think I've ever run as fast as I did to my car. I turned it on and flew down my driveway. It was chasing me. I could hear it, but there was no way I was going to stop. I was maybe 15 miles away from my house when I hit something and swerved into a tree. Lucky for me, it wasn't head-on, but my passenger side door was completely done for. Speaking of head-on, guess what was in the road? My dog's head. I didn't have a chance to grieve, though, because it was coming in fast. I spun around and let 3 shots ring out into its legs and chest. It screamed as it tumbled into the back of my car. I wasted no time and shot in the head before running into the woods and hiding in a tree. I can hear it whimpering. The music has completely stopped, but it's not dead. How the fuck is it not dead? I did it. It's dead. When it had its back turned, I shot the remaining bullets I had into the back of its head and chest. I won, but now I can hear faint music.